Hands up who's got children here.
Hands up what?
Who's got children?
Children,
Hands up who's got grandchildren.
No, grandchildren.
Hands up how many of them speak Patois.
God words.
Well, the first word I just ask them when I ring them is sakafet, and they answer me mola, which is, so always when they're able to talk, that's the first word. It doesn't go any further than that, but that's...
Mine know. Upakata, which means you don't hear. They know that one. And they'll know odd words, but not many.
How do you feel about not being able to speak the language?
Well, my children always says to me, how come you don't speak Patois to us? So I just said, well, my parents never spoke it to me, so I understand it more than I can speak it. So there you go.
My son went home with me in 2014. He spent 3 weeks in Dominica. And he said, Dad, why don't you show me or speak to me in that language? I said, well, your grandparents and your mum didn't want me to speak Patois to you because, you know, and so on and what have you. But I said, I bought a book for you. You should have. I said, you can read the thing, you know. So now he's teaching himself the Patois and my grandchildren, which is good.
Yes.
We have to bear in mind that Creole is the language of the enslaved. And the enslaved were looked down upon. And I think a people and their language are viewed through the same lens. So if the people are looked down upon, if the people are disparaged, I think the language is also disparaged. And that certainly was the attitude towards Creole, I would say up until 30, 40 years ago. Creole was associated with poverty, illiteracy, low socioeconomic status. So it was not, the language was not held in high regard.
As a random question, how many speakers do you reckon there are in Creole?
Well, there are speakers and then there are speakers. In terms of persons who can, what linguists would call a competent speakers, there are very, very few. In the research that I did for my book in 2013, 2014, I encountered, and I could have missed a few, but I encountered maybe 6 or 7 persons who I would describe as really competent speakers. And that is why I was so eager to record them, because I was keenly aware of the fact that once these persons move on, they take their language, they take the knowledge with them. And as a matter of fact, one of the persons, I would describe him as perhaps the most competent speaker. He passed away last year. Yeah, he was from a part of Grenada called Conference.
Do you think the language will survive in England?
That's a difficult question. It's difficult to say, but to be honest, it doesn't look good if I'm totally honest with you. If I'm brutally honest with you, it doesn't look good. Because like I said, my knowledge of the language is very minimal. And I have Dominican parents. Both my parents are Dominican and they were born there and they speak fluent Creole. So if I can be learning ABC 1, 2, 3, what are my children or somebody who, you know, it doesn't look good.
I don't think so. I think with that kind of, well, project such as yours and people really pushing for it, I don't see it lasting, because like we said before, there isn't a focus to learn the language. There doesn't seem to be any kind of group kind of pushing for the language. I mean, we have things like kind of the Kwéyòl and stuff like that, but then again, that's just for a day, and what happens afterwards? Nothing. You know, there isn't kind of any movement from it to kind of get people to speak it more than just on that one day.
Yeah. We can talk about things like books and classes and things like that, but all languages are learned at home.
Yeah.
From the parents. That's the best way to learn.
Yeah.
So that's what the parents should really be doing.
Yeah. It has to be kind of consistent.
Yeah, it has to be consistent.
It has to be consistent.
You must, obviously, you come across a lot of people from Dominican descent, Saint Lucia descent, Guadeloupe, Martinique, wherever, and they may be born in this country or raised in Europe or raised in the Caribbean, whatever. You know a lot of people or come across a lot of people. percentage-wise, how many of those people actually speak the language?
Ooh, wow, how many people that I know could speak Creole in terms of young people I've come across or people in general? I think if they've grown up here and they're Dominican or St. Lucian, I'd say without a shadow of a doubt less than 10%, probably about 5%. At least people of my sort of age. People of my grandparents' generation, I would say about 50% of them. Some of them had some knowledge of it. So my mum's mum, she said that she couldn't speak any when she came to England, and she effectively learned to speak Creole fluently in England and not Dominica. So that's, to me, was mind-blowing. I couldn't actually believe it. But I do believe her because she does speak Creole, but English comes more naturally to her because that's the language she's spoken mostly. She's fluent. But in terms of Guadeloupeans or Martinicans, I think that's when there's a difference. And I think because they speak French, there's obviously that connection between French and Creole that helps them keep the language alive, and they can slip into, I've noticed this on Twitter in particular, they slip into Creole more easily. For them, I would probably say maybe at least 60%, maybe more. It's difficult to tell, of course, without having physically gone to Guadeloupe or Martinique, but it's easy for them to kind of keep that connection, whereas for us that speak English, in particular the history that we have, it's different, and that affects the amount of people that can speak the language.
Like I said, no one really spoke Creole like directly to me, but like sometimes when I'll be like my grandma's house and like her friends will come over, I will hear them speaking Creole. That's about it, but I'm just like a bystander, don't really know what they're talking about.
Dans notre entourage, tout le monde parle créole et c'est logique et c'est normal. Ben, mes parents aimeraient que je parle un peu plus créole parce que finalement je parle pas assez créole et j'ai du mal à le faire. Je le comprends très bien, mais le parler je le fais pas assez.
Mes parents en sont très fiers et ma famille aussi, même si je fais quelques erreurs, mais en tout cas mon créole est assez bon, donc du coup ça va. Non, on n'est pas du tout encouragé à parler créole. C'était un peu mal vu à l'époque, mais maintenant ça revient et moi je vois mes petits cousins et cousines, ils parlent plus créole que moi en fait.
Alors la langue la plus parlée avec la famille, c'est surtout le français. Maintenant, c'est vrai que naturellement, on parle créole à la maison, donc on va dire c'est un petit peu des deux, c'est un mix des deux.
Were you ever forbidden from speaking Creole?
What do you mean?
Not allowed? Banned?
No, I could speak Creole if I wanted to.
Yes, but we don't have all the vocabulary, and we switch in for a few words, we switch in French, and we talk Creole French. It's very mixed.
The Creole language, I give it another 25 years. It is going to be extinct. Reasons being the stupid box, which I call television. It's a stupid box. West Indians are into American bull. And as such, in St. Lucia, I have realized that we try to talk like the Yankees, eat like the Yankees, sleep like the Yankees, wear the Yankees' clothes. So, as a matter of fact, the youth in this island, St. Lucia, 99.9% of them cannot speak the Creole language properly. So it shall be extinct.
I'm not afraid for the language. I don't agree with Jugbois. Jugbois is the king of Creole in St. Lucia, as you know. And I know he's concerned about the language, which is good, you know. But it has been proven any language that you translate in the New Testament, it survives. So I am not afraid for the language. And you know, this argument I have been hearing from the time I was a little boy. You know, I'm 60 years old. You understand? So if you're alive, you'll come and interview, and I'm alive in 25 years' time, Creole will still be around. You see? You know why? Because it's a hard language. You know. But what I want to happen, I want the government to take it seriously. You know. And don't worry about all the detractors we have. It's not their fault, you know, that's what they were taught. They believe if you teach people Creole, that's not a good language, and children they will not learn English properly. That's a myth. You understand? That is a myth. So I would like the government to look at the language, and if they're concerned about it, and if they believe that it is as important and dynamic, because let's face it, they use it on the political trail very, very often. Even those who cannot speak Creole, they try to speak Creole, I would like them to introduce it. It can be a pilot project, Introduce it at the school, from a primary level, so that the children will have a good idea of what it is, and they'll be able to learn to read it and write it, you see. And then maybe eventually Creole will reach the place it deserves in our society.
I don't think it's dying out.
Really? Not even in England?
I think so.
In England, yes, but for me, it's never going to die out because I'm always going to have it. So as long as my peers are around, it's not on its way out at all. Whereas because you've not got started, you feel like there's nowhere to go. Whereas for me, it's inherently there. I could pick up the phone and I could have a conversation with my aunt or whatever. For me, it's far from dying in that respect.
Yeah?
Yeah, I don't think it's dying.
It's maybe different for you. For me, I would say it is. Simply because amongst many of my peers that are from Creole speaking families, they don't speak it. When I go to Dominica, there's even some people there that can't speak it and they live there. And it's like if they're making babies with other people that can't speak it as well, I mean, it's gonna end up somewhere else, but it ain't gonna be in our mouths. Do you know what I mean? Honestly.
Very interesting phrase.
The language isn't going to be coming from us, just put it that way. It will be in like films and music. That's where I think we'll hear it. It'll be like the forgotten word.
Oh.
Like, I feel like in 100 years' time it will be like Shakespeare. Creole will be like Shakespeare.
Oh gosh, well this is scary.
Ouais. Pour moi, en Dominique, c'est même situation là parce que on croit ces jeunesses là, ouais, situation ça en danger ça en Dominique parce que en habitation, toutes ces jeunesses là, ils peuvent parler créole, mais en ville, ils ont ils comprennent mais pour parler c'est en dépendité mais mon croit si on continue comme ça, il peut disparaître. Parce que nous ne pouvons pas mettre en l'école là, nous ne pouvons pas mettre pli en la télévision, radio, tout comme ça.
Nous besoin ça. Hein.
Ouais. Et puis nous ne pouvons pas publier en nouvelles. Et puis là nous pouvons matcher en télévision là, nous pouvons matcher n'importe manière, vous comprenez? Nous ne pouvons pas respect mérité. Mais même en habitation là, tous ces parents là, toute maman, papa yo, ils peuvent parler créole mais ils peuvent pousser fort, vous comprenez? Cette jeunesse là, ils parlent mais c'est deuxième langage là. Ouais. C'est pas premier. Bon, mais mon crois en Sainte-Lucie, il plus riche.
Yeah.
Bon.
Ça vaut ça.
Parce que mon Dominique en habitation, il faut mais en ville même. Parce que si nous pas mettre en l'école là puis le président parler à cette télévision là pour montrer ces monde ça ici en langage il est mort. C'est pas actuellement mais peut-être il y a 100 années. Il y a 150 années il est mort. Et puis là ça arrive et qui est triste parce que si nous perdons ça nous perdons quoi nous perdons racine nous perdons culture nous héritage histoire toute bagaille nous qui perdons parce que c'est pas ni langage pas ni culture.
Moi, je pense que ce serait bien qu'il y ait une sorte d'union de la Caraïbe créolophone d'une manière générale. C'est pour ça qu'il y a des chercheurs qui parlent maintenant de pan-créole, c'est-à-dire, comme on dit, panafricanisme. Voilà, donc maintenant il est question de penser, comme on dirait, penser panafricain. Là, il est question de penser pan-créole.
What's missing, I would argue, is like listening material that's not only in song form, but for example, if you were to learn Spanish, right? You can go online and type in anything that's very specific to like learning Spanish, and you can get an audio for that. It's not the same in Creole, which is why we have got to create that. So sometimes we'll be in a class and like you heard different voices, and our students are like, "Who's that?" And we're like, "Oh, yeah, that sounds like you, but funny." Yeah. Because we've got to create that, because we don't have those kinds of resources. So that's why it takes so much time and effort and passion to create what we do create. What else is missing? A lot to do with like signage. Mm-hmm. And this is a conversation that we have a lot of the time, to see Creole in a formal sense, on a governmental level, and an institutional level. There are very, very few institutions, or like there's an ATM machine that you can pick to hear in either Creole or English. And there's one government body that if you call, they give you the option to either speak to the person in Creole or in English, and you get your instructions in Creole or in English. But that needs to be normalized. Those are very, very few examples. And being in Sainte-Lucie, you would expect that to be a lot more apparent and accessible. So yeah, formal Creole, and listening materials, I think, is missing.
So ideally, what we need to do is to work with the university and any other organization that's interested to promote the charter for the Creole-speaking countries of this of the region, of the Caribbean region. This charter was designed by linguists and language practitioners 10 years ago. Last year was the 10th anniversary. Came out of the International Center for Caribbean Language Research, ICCLR, at MONA, which is the umbrella organization for the Jamaican Language Unit, and works with the Guyanese Languages Unit and the Center for Lexicography at Kreyòl. So that charter, we have been in contact with CARICOM at least once in my generation and before in my predecessor's generation. We definitely want CARICOM to take that charter seriously, because everything's there. It's connected to the International Declaration of Linguistic Rights, which came out of Barcelona, I believe in 1996. And everything is there to show people how to shape, mold, and guide. All we need now is a legal team, people who understand language planning and language policy. And we can frame a national language policy which would cover everything from endangered languages to heritage languages to endangered heritage languages, spoken and signed, immigrant languages, languages of education, and all these things. And we need it. So it's a long, long, hard road, because people are so English only obsessed and focused that they really believe that for Caribbean people to be recognized in the outside world, why do you want to be speaking some little Caribbean language that nobody cares about? It's just such antiquated thinking.
There's this saying, and I think it's very outdated, and I've heard it many times in consultations and in linguistic books and whatever, like back in the day, that teaching a child 2 languages at the same time, that child is less intelligent because they won't be able to speak any language correctly or whatever. And I would say to that is an absolute lie. And I've actually heard that not too long ago from somebody. Hence, they were saying like why they're not teaching their child Creole. And I was very, very shocked. So I thought that mindset was extinct, essentially, but it's not. And a lot of people think that by teaching their children Creole, it's going to stunt their growth in this area or that area. And it's not true scientifically. If you don't want to take my words for it, like, it's not true. If anything, it will actually increase your neurological pathways, being able to understand things and being able to code switch and being able to use language as a fun way of communication actually makes you smarter. So hence why
knowing when to use what language
etc. So hence why please teach your children Creole if you can.
Yeah. I mean, if you, let's take an example of Finland or Croatia. How many people outside of Finland and Croatia, apart from immigrants and their children, go out of their way to learn Finnish and Croatian? And they're not considered world languages. Obviously, the European Union, the European languages, but they haven't gone out there and conquered the rest of the world. So they may have had, relation on the borders of whatever shared borders they have. You'll find other Croatian speakers. You'll find Croatian speakers in Italy, in Austria, etc., etc. But the point is that they don't go around having any hang-ups saying, "Oh, there are not enough people out there in the world who speak Croatian or Finnish." No, they have enough dignity, and the histories are completely different. If they had histories of subjugation, it's very different. I mean, French Creole was obviously born more recently. You can practically track its history and its development in ways that are different from looking at European history. But people don't say my language is only spoken by, 4 million people, and therefore it's not relevant. People say, no, that's my language. That's my nation's language. It's my symbol of national identity. My children must be taught in it. Our laws must be in it. All the street signs, all the birth certificates, everything is in my language. And the basic principle of pedagogy is to move from the known to the unknown. So you must teach your child in the language of the home. Why would a child very happy playing games with siblings and cousins and parents and other people around them speaking their language, and then they go to school and receive this horrible rude culture shock where they're told that their language is inferior and don't speak like that, and then the parents reinforce and say, when you go to school, you can't speak like that. And that is the Creole language thing that people are so against. And so it's really, really bad attitudes that we've harbored in the Caribbean for a long, long time.
Do you think the Creole that's spoken across the islands that we're talking about is in a healthy place?
I think so.
I think so. Why? Because I'm going to give an example. I think I mentioned it before. In the case of the Guadeloupe, Martinique, Sainte-Lucie, and Dominica, the geographical location, because it's 15 minutes away or less between those islands, and you have a constant movement of citizens of all these islands. So I would say, and then you have radio station in French Creole in Guadeloupe and Martinique, which never used to happen maybe 40 years ago. But the first radio station came out in the early 80s, and Radio Caraïbe started in Saint Lucia. Then they had a license to operate in Martinique. So in that respect, I think it's quite healthy.
I would answer by saying that when it comes to language preservation and continuity, you do have certain indicators, and French Creole would fall, at least Atlantic French Creole would fall into that scale of the indicators to consider it having a positive future. It's being passed on. There are written works. It's being used in the education system. It's being used in the society, and there is no overt push to make it not be used. So it does have a bright future from that perspective. The negative association that it had in the past no longer exists. You will have contexts where the odd person may not want to, but for the average individual in any of these societies, they see French Creole as a viable means of communication. And once you have that, then you can see a positive future.
Qui manière nous ça fait plus que la première empêcher que la mort. Seule manière ça fait ça, c'est si nous parler. Ça c'est seule manière, c'est si nous parler, si nous continuer à parler. Puis la nia ba yo ka dire en créole là à la rose c'est un grand festin créole. Un festin créole que le monde ka chanter, ka danser. La nia chanter ka aller Aïe 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 maman est la rose. Oui 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 maman est la rose. Aïe 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 maman est la rose. Si nous pas bouillir, nous caille mort. Si nous pas bouillir, nous caille mort. C'est même bagarre là, si ou pas parler, il caille mort. Quoi seule manière pour faire certain qu'il va là par moi, c'est pour nous continuer à parler toutes les. C'est pour nous encourager Jean nous et puis l'autre monde, ailleurs nous, tout le monde parler. Maman nous. Parce que là nous qu'à parler et qu'à être vivant. Et c'est ça nous voulons.
Well, all languages have innovation. That's the concept of innovation. So this song would be making reference to the fact that it's important for Creole to survive. It would need innovation. Just like English, with the arrival of technology, there are new words that have been incorporated, French, any other language. So indeed, for Creole to keep up with the times, it also has to innovate.
Je dis, une femme qui marche, ou quand une femme qui marche la rue, il y a un peu bœuf et puis un peu kitchen. Une femme qui marche, c'est que ça y est. C'est qui maman maladie. Il qui est malade, il a gondé. Il a gondé. Il a délivré maladie ou bao. C'est que ça a été dit qu'il a marché et puis qu'il a parlé avec le monde.
At the end of the 19th century, practically everybody spoke patois. By the middle of the 20th century, when I would have been a small child, approximately half of the people that I was aware of were fluent in patois. So let's give that approximately 50%. But by the end of that same 20th century, small children, some of them didn't even know that the language existed.
You know, I know for sure that the language started to decline in the 1930s, so you probably will have to split that period and from between, say, the early 1900s to the mid 1900s, because from, like I said, from the 1930s onwards, the language started to decline and to decline quite rapidly. But I would tell you that there was a census that was done, now going back, in 1783. That was the year the British took control of Grenada. That was finally, that was the last time that Grenada fell into the hands of the British and remained there. Didn't change hands again. But in 1783, it was found that only 2% of the population spoke English or some comprehensible form of English. The rest of the population spoke either French, or the vast majority would have spoken Creole, and they would have been monolingual Creole speakers. They would have spoken Creole only.
So my grandmother spoke it fluently. Her mother, my great-grandmother, spoke it almost exclusively. My mother understood it in parts, in bits, so that, you know, they could communicate, particularly when, you know, we weren't supposed to hear what they were talking about. But I would say my grandmother was born in 1884, so I would say that up until the early part of the 20th century, the early, you know, probably between 1900 and 1930, I think that's when the last speakers of Creole started, you know, phasing out and fading out after that point. And then the retentions we have, we see it more in the place names and the family name. My family name is Martino. And what I grew up with was a lot of words in the language that, so we said, you know, you said things like bonje or bon Dieu, as the Saint Lucians would more say bon Dieu. We said bonjé and we. He always said we at the end of things, meaning yes, but she liked meat we, or she big we, or that was fairly common, and so there were a lot of as I said, words and phrases in the language, and even when we spoke the English. Sometimes the English was based on the construction of the phrase or the sentence was based on French, the French Creole. So people would say it make hot rather than a feeling hot or I am hot. They say it make hot, and that's a direct translation of Ife chaud, which is the French, it literally it makes hot or it makes cold, So those are the things I remember, as I said, growing up.
Now people will tell you, and I've heard this over and over, my grandparents spoke Creole, but they only spoke it when they didn't want us to understand what they were saying, which is entirely true. However, I think we need to step back further and ask ourselves, why did they do that? I mean, if you are a parent, I think every parent wants the best for his or her child. So you pass on to your children or to your child the things that you perceive to be valuable. So I think if Creole, in their minds, if it were perceived as a language that had value, they would have passed it on. But it was denigrated, it was dismissed, it was described in the most pejorative terms. So they did not see it as anything of value, so they didn't pass it on. So it served the useful purpose as what I call in my book a language of exclusion, when they wanted to exclude children from whatever was being discussed by adults, what they would, in Grenada we would say big people, again coming straight from Creole, which is grand moon. So when they wanted to have these discussions, they just switched to Creole.
Most of the Africans seem to become Roman Catholic because the French were Roman Catholic. So when Grenada was colonized initially, it was colonized by the French in the 16th century. And so whoever came afterwards as enslaved Africans, when they were evangelized, they would have become mainly Roman Catholic. Later on, you had the Church of England coming in, and there being a lot of interplay between the Church of England and the Roman Catholic Church. So that an effort was made for even the Roman Catholic Church, which had been having their worship in a francophone manner, to now become anglophone. Some people, some thinkers have suggested that the phase of Latin as a form of worship might have been an intermediate phase to enable change from one Romance language to the Anglophone Romance language. That probably belongs, although it's a thought worth having, it might be in the realm of speculation in part, if not in total.
But as I said earlier, the French controlled Grenada for 114 years. That was an uninterrupted period, from 1649 to 1763. From then, between 1763 and 1783, Grenada then changed hands, British, French. And so that during that 20-year period, there was a lot of animosity between the French and the British, which was not typical of the other islands. I think in Grenada, the animus or the acrimony between the French and the British, I think you know, those feelings of hostility were much greater, much deeper in the case of Grenada. So that when the British finally wrested control of Grenada from the French in 1783, there had been so much bitterness, so many attacks between the British and the French. I think a desire to settle scores, maybe. I think that the British really sought to stamp out everything that was French. And in that effort, certainly Creole was not spared. So that really, I think that started the whole effort to get rid of Creole. But you cannot just eradicate a language overnight. There are other important reasons why Grenada's Creole declined. And as I said, the decline really started in the 1930s. But from the time it started, I think that process of decline was remarkably swift for a language. Creole, I think it is one of the factors, I think, that, or one of the many factors, because I don't think you can say that there was any moment or any event that marked the decline of Creole. Like I said, beginning in 1783 with the British, that effort, yes, that was a key moment. Based of Creole words are interspersed, but what I have found is that is becoming less and less so. I would give you an example. When I was growing up, for example, it was common to hear someone saying that this person likes to mauvais langue people. Right, he'll speak. I think now if you ask the average 20-year-old Grenadian what mauvais langue means, I'm not sure that child or that young person would be able to tell you the meaning of that. So I think even the words, the vocabulary I mean, the lexicon, I think that is disappearing.
Today we'll be looking at the Creole from Grenada and Sainte-Lucie. To say I don't know those people, in Grenada they say, mo ba kone moun sa ye no? And in Sainte-Lucie we say, mwe pa kone tse moun sa. I'm not giving them anything. In Grenada they say, Mo baka baye is shen bagay. And in Sainte-Lucie we say, Mwe baka bayo rien. To say I didn't have money for this. In Grenada they say, Mo batini l'argent pour ça. And in Sainte-Lucie we say, Mwe patini l'argent pour ça. To say they're not ready yet. In Grenada they say, Ye boko pawe. And in Sainte-Lucie we say, Yo poko pawe.
I think in 1882, there was a bylaw, I think it was called, that was passed in 1882, stating that the use of Creole in schools was to be actively discouraged. So again, you see how in the education system, there was this effort to get rid of Creole altogether. Another reason, I think, for the decline of language is migration. Grenada has always had a stubbornly high rate of migration. You know, in the 40s, people were going to Aruba and Curacao. The 50s, the 60s to England, largely. The 70s onwards, I think, to North America, particularly the United States. So if a language is to remain stable, its people must be stable. And we have never been a stable people. We have always been reaching out, leaving Grenada in search of better opportunities for ourselves, for our children. You compare Grenada, say, with an island like St. Lucia or Dominica. Geographically, St. Lucia is 25 miles away from Martinique. There are ferries that go between Sainte-Lucie and Dominica, Martinique, Guadeloupe. So there is that, and it's essential. There are some differences, but essentially it's the same language. So our geography, our location, our physical location has not helped us. We are much further away from Martinique and Guadeloupe.
But the last thing I would say, do you think it's been a major loss, losing the language, or do you think it's just a thing that time goes on and things pass?
I would think it's a major loss, because you lose something when you lose a language, even though it was a second language. Ways of thinking and seeing, as I said, which is exactly why, as I said earlier, a number of the phrases and the constructions that we use in English harks back to the French, you know. And historically, what I find interesting with the French Creole is that a lot of the grammar and the vocabulary is frozen in time, because of course that would have been the French that would have been spoken at that time that they translated into the French Creole. So you also lose a bit of history as well, you know, because when I worked with Dr. Alsop on the Dictionary of Caribbean English Usage, and what I came to appreciate working on the dictionary, I came to appreciate the word origins, you know, and when I started researching some of the French Creole words from Grenada, I realized it was Old French. A lot of it was Old French, and which was interesting. So you also, I think you also lose a bit of your history as well, you know. So, and it is nice to have a second language. I mean, I used to envy the St. Lucians and the Dominicans when they could just burst into Creole when I was on campus, you know. And you think, oh Lord, you know, I wish I could, you know, you wish you could understand them or speak with them or whatever. It's always nice to have a second language, you know.
I don't think the future of Grenada's Creole is a very bright one. I mean, I'm taking a very clear-eyed view. I wish I could say otherwise, but as time goes on, I think the language recedes further and further into the background of Grenada's linguistic landscape. However, I think that there are things that can be done to preserve some knowledge of it. I think, for example, even to retain the words that we use that are derived from French-based Creole. I think there is a lot. But then again, I would add that we have to be very careful, because we have words that we use, imported words, that have been imported from African languages. You have a word like Congori, which comes from Nongoli, it's an African-derived word. We have words that are derived from Grenada's indigenous people, from the Kalinago. Words, even Carriacou, that comes from the indigenous people. So again, we have to be careful. And in writing my book, I was very careful. If I could not make a connection of a particular Creole word with the French language, I did not include it. Because you can be led astray and attribute things to French that are really not derived from French. Anyhow, I think I digress.
Because for us in Martinique, we didn't know that there was people speaking Creole in Trinidad. And it's when we went with Kasab, you know, in the 70s, we went to Trinidad, and we went to Mount Paramine, and we met, you know, people coming from Martinique. They were coming from Martinique speaking Creole. They were there because, you know, after the eruption of the Mount Pelée, many Martinicans went to Trinidad. So and they were in Mount Paramine, but it's not only there that they were speaking Creole. And still, I saw a documentary not so long ago where they were showing, you know, people singing, you know, in a choir in Creole and everything. Yeah, yeah.
The reason why I'm laughing to myself is because my pronunciation of things is so terrible. Cédula de población.
Yeah,
thank you.
Yes, the cédula de población. Now, we have to remember that there were two of them. Huh? People often forget that. There was one that was issued in 1776, and then there was a second one in 1783. Now, this 1783 one would have coincided with the year that the British finally took permanent control of Grenada. So I think that historically, that is a significant date. Now, the Cédula de Población was really an edict issued by Spain or Spain's representatives, inviting people to migrate to Trinidad, because at the time Trinidad was terribly underpopulated. So what they did was they gave special incentives for people to migrate from French-speaking islands, French Creole-speaking islands, because remember there was the element of Catholicism, so they wanted to bring people into Trinidad who were Catholic. So they invited people to migrate. The first cedula was not very successful. It was the 1783 one that was particularly successful and saw people migrate from places like Martinique, Dominica, and especially Grenada to Trinidad. So Trinidad owes its Creole, and Trinidad still has a fair amount of Creole. I mean, I've visited Trinidad, I've gone to into the Creole-speaking communities with Namdi. Trinidad still has a fair amount of Creole, but Trinidad owes its Creole to this Cédula de Población, which would never have come about. The Creole language would never have been introduced into Trinidad were it not for the Cédula de Población, particularly the 1783 one. So because Trinidad, as I said, was never colonized by the French. There was never a French presence. So I think people are often puzzled as to why there is French-based Creole in Trinidad. It's from that influx of immigrants from the other island. And as I said, Grenada featured prominently in that influx.
Somewhere between 1779, 1797, and 1801, when the English did their first census of Trinidad, everybody spoke French or French Creole. Everybody spoke Patois.
French Creole came to Trinidad in 1783. Of course, we know it has many different names: French Lexicon Creole, French Lexified Creole, French Lexified Creole, Patois. In the Port of Spain Gazette, I was reading about Negro French, French Creole, Creole French, of course, the total misnomer, Broken French, etc. But it came to Trinidad in 1783 when Trinidad was still a Spanish colony. And then the island was captured by the British in 1797. But Spain officially let go of Trinidad between December 1802, January 1803. So there was a sort of 5-year period where they finally had to have an agreement and a treaty to, fight over the island. But the point is that Trinidad was never French. It was never colonized by the French. Tobago was. And yet we ended up with French Creole in Trinidad because the Spanish crown allowed a Frenchman born in Grenada to negotiate with them to have a settlement period where French people French colonists, I suppose, from the islands, Grenada, Martinique, Sainte-Lucie, Dominica, Guadeloupe, Haiti, all of those places where French was spoken and French Creole was spoken. So on paper, French came during the Spanish period, but French Creole came as well because people were bilingual. The Africans were to some extent bilingual in both codes, and the French themselves were to some extent bilingual. So the degrees of bilingualism are not going to discuss. The fact is that both languages came. And French died here, but French Creole, I'm happy to say, il vive toujours. French Creole still lives.
Parler papa, famille, grand-maman, maman. Yo ka parler pis camarade yo me ka toujours mande yo ça zot ka di parler contre me toujours te ka mande yo. Ça e zot ka parler contre. Mix up. Et peut-être yo ka di moi, et peut-être yo parler la Grenade, Sainte-Lucie, tout mix up. Empeta yo ke diu?
Caribbean people.
Lot fois yo ka pa ka diu an kon sa yo ka pale kon.
French Creole was talked a lot about in newspapers, especially because you had people who needed interpretation or interpreting in the courts. Because some people at one point were monolingual Creole speakers. So there was reference to the need for interpreters in the courts. I also came across an advertisement, I was so excited, of a hotel in Trinidad, in Port of Spain, that basically advertised itself as multilingual. It says, we have people here who speak English, French, Spanish, and French patois. And I was like, wow. So there was some degree of recognition when different islanders would come from, even people from Venezuela who spoke French Creole and Spanish, they could find a room in the inn where both their languages would be spoken. And it obviously catered to French and French Creole speakers, but also English and French Creole speakers and Spanish and French Creole speakers. Well, of course, John Jacob Thomas was the first one that we know officially tried to put it in writing in 1869. French Creole started to decline probably at the well, in a most prominent way in the early 20th century. Now, in the 19th century, now you only start seeing fruit after the tree is planted, right? So the roots have to develop first before you see the fruit. So the roots of this, I believe, the roots of the decline of French Creole, I believe, are twofold. Number one, the language was already socially subordinate and wasn't given any respect or prominence, well, until John Jacob Thomas came along. And that always put it in a socially challenged and precarious position. But of course, you always have an underground movement where people will continue to be themselves in private, even if the public says we're not accepting this language. But the real issue, in terms of a national decision, was the Anglicization policy that was undertaken, because Trinidad was a problem for the British Crown. We were at one point, people who talk about these things like to say we were a British colony, we still had Spanish laws, but the 90-something% of the population was French and French Creole speaking. So that doesn't make for easy governance when the British are there trying to speak English and everybody's like, well, I'm speaking in Spanish, I'm speaking in French and French Creole, or one or the other, or both. And then you have people who came along in the mid-19th century, speakers of Bhojpuri and Hindi and Tamil and other Indian languages, and Yoruba was coming back in even well after the slave trade. And then of course the Chinese immigrants with at least 3 languages, including Cantonese, Mandarin, and Hakka. So it was like a little Babel, right? Port of Spain had at one time had anywhere between 20 to 30 languages on the street. So this was not a happy thing for any governor. And so the Attorney General at the time was Charles William Warner. He was the one who drove the Anglicization policy. And basically, everybody in Trinidad was told, you are not going to be granted English rights and privileges if you don't speak English. So because of that, education became a very powerful tool in the hands of the colonizers, and they made sure that English was the language of instruction in the ward schools. And now the ward schools were not even like the French schools in the city. The first school in this country was St. Joseph's Convent, which was run by French nuns. So the language of education was French, and that obviously annoyed the powers that were. And this Anglicization policy not only targeted the well-to-do people in the urban areas, but it also penetrated the countryside, because the ward schools were in the rural areas. And so you had children who were monolingual, speakers of various languages, and people who if they spoke English with an accent that was different from even Port of Spain English. So it's like everybody who didn't speak English was targeted. Even if French Creole was not named, it had to be targeted because it was the majority language. And it wasn't just the majority language of native speakers, it was the lingua franca. So that even if French Creole wasn't your mother tongue, it was the second language that you learned because you had to live. You had to trade, you had to buy, you had to sell. So everybody, up to the early 20th century, Syrian Lebanese were learning French Creole. In the middle of the 19th century, Bhojpuri and Hindi speakers learned French Creole. Chinese speakers, everybody had Portuguese, everybody. Once you had a shop and you were selling, or once you had to buy, you had to learn some French Creole. So the language got targeted. To speed up the Anglicization process, it couldn't just be a matter, as you pointed out, that it was just you just put the language in schools. Who's going to teach it? So yes, Barbadian teachers were recruited, Barbadian nurses and doctors, and also Barbadian policemen. So policemen to enforce law and order, and teachers to enforce the language in the schools, and other people would have come in different capacities. So it seemed to be quite a full-scale Anglicization policy and movement. And so we ended up with at least one Nobel Prize winner, V.S. Naipaul, in the English language. So, but our everyday speech is still very much our Trinidadian English Creole. Even if the words are English, the structures are still French Creole. Now, obviously, all Creoles in the Atlantic area have a lot of commonalities, but the relationship between Trinidadian English Creole and Trinidadian French Creole is clear, from accent to vocabulary to onomatopoeia, discourse markers. So French Creole, as much as it's struggling to survive, it still has strong echoes in our everyday speech. So you have lots of grandchildren and great-grandchildren who could talk about, oh, my grandparents speak Patois fluently, etc., etc. But we think there are only a few hundred left in the country as native speakers, and the ones we've met are all bilingual.
I do believe that a lot of credit should go to the likes of Dr. Joanne Ferreira and Nnamdi Hodge. They do a lot to keep the language alive in terms of creating documents, documenting the language in academia, creating community groups where the language can be taught and learnt by those in the community, creating Facebook groups like Anu Pale Patois, which has been created by Joanne and others. I do hope that a nation like Trinidad and Tobago, which is rich in history and culture, can realise how important this language is and provide the likes of Dr. Joanne Ferreira and Nnamdi Hodge with the right support so this language is cared for properly.